Welcome back, Spartans. Today we are going to take a look into obedience and the rise of authoritarianism. And this is a growing movement in our society because more and more people are becoming obedient, listening to the government with blind obedience and doing what they have to say without questioning their authority, without thinking critically. We have this whole concept of group think where everybody is thinking the same, and you have seen them, all those blue pillars who are stuck in the matrix, who are all thinking the same, and if you basically say something different, they will attack you for saying that because they want to defend the matrix. And we have to understand this, because if we don't, the future is going to be hard. We have to understand this to prevent this from happening. So I actually just did this whole presentation without pressing the record button. So let's do it again. So what is obedience? Obedience is to do what is told. Submission to another one's authority. To be a good person is to be a compliant person in the eyes of the state. Our particular problem in the present day is an overwhelmingly tendency towards conformity. In such times, ethics tends more and more to be identified with obedience. One is good to the extent that one obeys the dictates of society. It is as though the more unquestionable obedience, the better. So the more obedient you are in the eyes of the state, the better person you are. Just take a look at the military. The more obedient you are, the better a soldier you are. And basically conformity is like doing what a group is doing, basically. And authority is, of course, the rule of the one who is in charge. So a few examples of obedience in our modern day. And the question we have to ask ourselves, is obedience always good? And some might say, obedience is always good. You have to be obedient. You have to listen to what is being told. Because if you don't, we have an unfunctional system. Our system isn't working. But I would say that obedience is not always good. But obedience is good in the military. If you are an obedient soldier, you are a good soldier. If you actually do what you want to do, you're a bad soldier because you have to do what is being told. And we see a lot of those cases. Let's look at Nazi Germany in the 1940s. In the eyes of Nazi Germany, in the eyes of the state, those soldiers were heroes. Those soldiers were defending the country, and they were good people because they were doing what was being told. They were exterminating the Jews, and for that they were heroes because they did what they were being told. But any rational person these days would say that this is a horrible thing to do. And those people, what is wrong with those people? Can't they think for themselves? And this is a classical case of blind obedience. These soldiers just did what they were being told to do without thinking critically and just doing it. And soldiers today are still doing it. And you might say, well, that was in the 1940s. That will never happen again. But I think that's wrong. History repeats, and it certainly rhymes, And this was a very hard case, a very extreme case, but blind obedience is still active today. Let's take a look, Let's take a look at the picture below, those soldiers there just destroyed that whole village and probably murdered those people and raped women. But they were just following orders, maybe not for the raping of women, but that's a thing soldiers do. It's horrible, but they were just following orders. So who's in the wrong here? Or is it the politician who is wrong? But he only gave the order. Who is actually wrong here? I would argue that the soldiers were definitely more wrong because they were actually the one who were doing the action. They were just blindly following orders. But the politician, he was just giving orders, and I would argue that he's also wrong, but not. I think the soldiers are more wrong here. But the politician, the thing is, the politician doesn't see the consequences of his actions. He isn't actually on the ground to actually look at the devastation, all those people that are being murdered. He doesn't know. And he is still evil for giving the order, but he isn't seeing the consequences of his actions. So in today's day and age, there is a rise of obedience, and it's quite scary actually. People are becoming more and more like sheep, and we saw this during the COVID pandemic. It was very, very obvious during the COVID pandemic. If you weren't if you didn't do what the group was doing, you were basically being an outsider, and social conformity is becoming more and more the norm. If you don't belong to the group, you are an outsider, and people are weaker than ever, and they are afraid to actually step up. They're afraid to actually speak their mind and think critically. And yeah, we are basically all the same. It is almost as if the Matrix, the movie The Matrix is more important now than ever. If you haven't watched The Matrix in the last 2 years, go watch it, or go watch it again, because it's such a good movie, You see, all those people who are stuck in the Matrix are basically the blue pillars who don't know anything. They will do everything in their power to defend the system from those people who are not in the Matrix, who are basically critical thinkers. And you will also see in the movie, when you actually step out of the Matrix, people who are in the Matrix will actually turn into a smith and attack you. And that's what they do as well today. If you are actually in a group and you are a critical thinker, all the people in the group will actually attack you, demonize you, tell you that you are some kind of conspiracy theorist. And people are so weak these days, and back in the days that wasn't actually the case. Back in the days there were a lot of revolutions. Like, I've read some books about the history, and back in the days when people didn't accept the status quo of the government, they would actually overthrow the government, and they would actually just step up and actually fight off the military just to overthrow the government. And I'm not saying that's a good thing to do, but people were taking action these days, believe me. And today we are just basically standing back. And to be honest, I am still standing back a bit. I'm trying to convince a lot of people of this way of thinking, but we have to be obedient these days. Politicians want us to be obedient these days, because if we are not obedient, we won't accept the new rules. So if we are critical thinkers, thinking for ourselves, we will maybe come into some kind of revolution and overthrow the government or anything like this. So we have to be obedient. We have to be the same to accept the new rules. And you might have seen some of those new rules lately, because we can really see those new rules. For example, in the COVID pandemic, they had all these crazy rules. But let's not go into that topic right now. But you might have heard about the World Economic Forum, and they basically talk about implementing something called the Great Reset. We have to totally change the status quo. We have to totally change the system if we want to be successful in the next century. And they have all kinds of crazy new things. And basically the WEF, the World Economic Forum, is a big organization where all the world leaders from all around the world will come together and talk about the new government, talk about all kinds of important things. And the World Economic Forum has all kinds of things they want to implement. One of those things, and they actually had this on their website, is in 2030, you will own nothing and you will be happy. They basically want to make everything state-owned, from housing, cars, bikes. So you are actually renting everything from the state. And this is fucking crazy, This is communist shit. I think we have proven communism doesn't really work, but apparently they want to go back. They have all kinds of crazy experiments. Another one they want to implement is, for example, they want to make sure that everybody is eating bugs, or especially they want to implement the bug diet. So because murdering animals for consumption is bad. And I'm not battling the vegans here, but I don't want to be eating bugs, guys. And they have all kinds of ideological experiments. And to accept these new rules, we have to be obedient. And that's why they are pushing us to become more obedient. So let's look into that now. How is obedience actually created? So Obedience is created through, there are a few ways, of course, and I will talk about these ways now. One of those ways is external threats, because if there is an external threat, we will come together as one. We have no time to make a conflict in our society, because we have an external threat we have to worry about. So, for example, a few external threats are the COVID pandemic. We all have to do the same, because otherwise we won't get out of the dangerous pandemic. The Ukraine war, of course. Forget everything you know about the Ukraine war. If you've actually listened to the normal media, it's just they're just telling you what to think. Okay, I'm not gonna go into detail here. And another thing is climate change. We all have to do the same, because climate change. We all have to become electric and drive electric cars, because that's so good. How do you think the energy of the electric cars is actually generated? 99% of the energy is generated by nuclear plants or coal mines, not actually by how do you say this, windmills or like solar panels. But let's not go into detail here. If you want to know about all these things, by the way, just leave a comment, because I don't actually know if you're interested in all these things. Like maybe you're interested in the wars, maybe you're interested in wars in the Middle East, and all these things. I know a lot about them, but I didn't really go into detail about all those things in my channel, because I wanted to focus more on self-improvement. But because I think this is a big part about self-improvement as well. I think as a human being, you should know these things. You should know how the world really works. This is a part of self-improvement, I think. And let's go into these external threats. They need external threats. If you actually look at the past 4 years, they had external threats all the time. It began with COVID. Now it's directly going into the Ukraine war. And when the Ukraine war is over, they go into climate change. When that's dealt with, or still being dealt with, they will go into a new threat, because climate change is getting old. We need a new thing. They will go into a war with China. That's probably happening in the future somehow, because you see a lot of propaganda about that these days. And that's when we go into propaganda, they have to convince the public of actually supporting these external threats. Because if we are not supporting these external threats, we can't keep going, So we basically have to convince the plebs of keep going what we are doing right now. For example, keep sending weapons to Ukraine, because otherwise Ukraine is going to lose. So we need more weapons. And everybody, when you actually look at outside of the media of the West, people actually tell you that they should stop sending weapons, because it's only destroying the country. It's only devastating public areas. But during the COVID pandemic, of course, there was a lot of propaganda, like we have to wear the masks, we have to do this thing, and we have to do this thing. And they will convince people to keep these external threats going, to keep investing in these external threats. And whatever your political opinion is about Ukraine, COVID, climate change, this is the thing they are doing. They are propagating their beliefs. So don't let these political opinions distract you from the fact that this is happening. And another way they are doing it is during our education system. And you've probably heard about this, because the education system is not to produce, to actually educate people and to actually produce critical thinkers who can start their own businesses and be rich. Fuck no. They are to produce obedient workers. Obedient workers for the system, for the factories, for the state, who don't question the authority. And they want to keep them poor and stupid, because people who are poor and stupid don't know how to get out of certain things. And that's when they give away their authority to somebody bigger, because they will say, oh, please save me, government, give me a bit more money, just do whatever you need to do, but save me. So And you need to be dependent on the system. You need to be dependent on the system to be obedient. And that's also when they do a lot of propaganda in the education system. And one thing I think, to be honest, I will never send my kids to a normal education because I know these things are happening. They are also spreading a lot of propaganda in these schools. Even 4 to 8-year-olds get a lot of propaganda in schools because they will tell these kids to think a certain way. They will convince these kids of a certain viewpoint. In Holland, we actually got a few news outlets who are actually focused on kids, and the things they tell these kids, it's unbelievable. It's horrible. Actually, it's dangerous. It's dangerous. I don't think it's okay, to convince these kids of a certain viewpoint. And if you actually are invested in these things, you actually know that that's pure bullshit what they are telling these kids. But yeah, to be honest, I will never send my kids to these public schools because I know it is to produce obedient workers, and I don't want my kids to be obedient workers who are not critically thinkers. That's deep. We are going deep now. I hope you are still with me. So groupthink. That's another very big one we're going to talk about here. So as you see in the picture here, everybody is the same NPC, the same copy of each other. Everybody's thinking the same. Groupthink is another way of stimulating obedience. So groupthink is basically a phenomenon within a group of people. It is the desire for harmony and conformity. It is the desire to be the exact same, because if you are not the same, you don't belong to the group. You are an outsider, and the media is actually demonizing these outsiders. That's a very interesting thing. But the problem with being the same, thinking the same, without critically thinking is it leads to irrational decision making, because the basis of a democracy is people who are different, but they talk about that difference with each other. They talk about their different viewpoints, but that's basically old school now. We all have to think the same here. And if you actually don't think the same, you're an outlier. So we have to agree at all costs, because if you don't, you'll be thrown outside of the group. You'll be demonized. So there is basically no critical thinking in group think. And this is this is a very big thing in today's society. People look at the COVID pandemic. If you actually talked about, or look at the Ukraine war. Everybody is thinking the same thing, and if you don't, you're basically a demon. You're Satanists. Guys, I have been in social groups where groupthink was a big thing, where everybody was thinking the same. And when I actually, said something different, people would actually demonize me and actually told me I was a bad person. How can you think like this? What the fuck is wrong with you? We have to do what the government tells us to do, otherwise. And groupthink is becoming more and more obvious these days. It's the root basically of obedience, and they did a lot of social experiments as well on the street. So let me explain this to you. How is this conducted? So social experiments. So there were two groups of people. So one group was people who were in on the experiment. They knew about it, and one or two persons who didn't, who weren't part of the experiment, were just coming in. So they asked these people, which line is actually bigger? So they had two lines, and one was obviously bigger than the other, and one was smaller. So all the guys who were in on the experiment would all tell them, would all tell them the false answer, basically. And what did those guys do who weren't in on the experiment? They did exactly the same what the whole group was doing, even though they knew that their answer was wrong, just to belong to the group, because they knew if I give another answer, if I give the right answer, I'll be thrown out of the group. So people will do everything just to belong to a group, just to be the same. And to be honest, this wasn't really the case back in the days. This is becoming more and more apparent. All this blind obedience leads to authoritarianism, and authoritarianism, a very long word, is a term for basically the use of a strong central power to preserve the political status quo, so to make sure the system keeps working or expands, with new rules. Basically, authoritarianism in religion and science, let alone politics, is becoming increasingly accepted. Not particularly because so many people explicitly believe in it, but because they feel themselves individually powerless and anxious. So basically, obedience leads to authoritarianism. Weakness in the population leads to a government which is stronger and stronger. And this leads to authoritarianism is basically, I would say, a lot of misuse of power. A lot of severe government measures like curfews, like you have to be inside about this time, which they did with the COVID pandemic, banning certain groups from operating, or censorship, like censorship on YouTube. And a lot of those, if you look at social media, a lot of social media profiles have actually been deleted because they have different viewpoints that weren't belonging to the group think. And if you are different than the group, you will be demonized, you will be censored. Actually, the media will actually tell you that person, you shouldn't believe that person because he's a conspiracy theorist. So yeah, misuse of power, all kinds of crazy measures, like the social credit system in China. You might have heard about this. It's actually some crazy system based on points, and people will actually get a certain amount of points, and if they do good things in the eyes of the government, they will get more points. And if they do bad things, like actually speak out against the government or do certain things which the government don't want you to do, like read books, I don't know, but then they will deduct a few points, they will take away a few points. And so what's the hassle on that? So if you get down to a certain amount of points, not enough, they will actually prevent you from traveling, prevent you from taking planes, or doing groceries, or buying alcohol, doing certain things, so they can control you. This is crazy. This is actually happening in China. I am not from China. Maybe there are some guys here from China, so please explain it to me if you have any additions here. But it's a crazy system. Basically, it's a surveillance state. That's another one. They will keep track of all the people, to make sure they don't do anything that the government doesn't want them to do. They don't join any groups which speak out against the government. And also by further demonizing the non-compliant, of course. And a big example of this is in Canada. And I would personally say that Canada is a good example of a state that is more authoritarian than ever, is going towards this, because they did a few things especially during the COVID pandemic. There was this trucker movement of big truckers who are basically blocking the highway and basically protesting against the COVID mandates. And a lot of the people were in favor of them. A lot of the people would say that the thing they were doing was a good thing, but the government basically arrested them and blocked their bank accounts. Like, they blocked their bank accounts. Like, what the fuck? Those people weren't able to buy groceries, weren't able to buy anything because they couldn't spend their digital money. And who even has normal money these days? That's a horrible thing to do. That's what we see with the rise of CBDC, central bank digital currency. They want to implement some kind of digital currency. So basically, the government has all the control to do these things, to block your bank account, to make sure you don't buy certain things. It's horrible. And for many people, for many obedient people these days, government is the new God. It's not Jesus, it's not God, it's the government, because the government has all the power. It's fucking crazy. It's walking out of hand. And you might have heard about this book, 1984, and I've actually got it here from George Orwell. I haven't read it yet, but I think I heard that it's a very good book about the rise of obedience and authoritarianism, because this is basically a prediction of the way our society is going these days, into basically a surveillance state with cameras, crazy government measures. And if you haven't read this book, I would suggest you buy it, because I've heard it was very, very good. And it's a stupid thing to say because I haven't read it yet, but I've heard it's a very, very good book to actually understand what's going on these days. Yeah, that's the end of the presentation, guys. I hope you learned something these days. I hope you learned something from this presentation. If you want to know more, just leave a comment and tell me if you find this interesting or not. Okay, guys, see you in the next one. Spartans, prepare for glory.